December 17, 1878, the snow fell heavily across the Pennsylvania countryside, blanketing the rolling hills surrounding Miller Estate in pristine white. Margaret Sutton pulled her woolen shawl tighter as the carriage approached the imposing three-story Victorian mansion. Its dark silhouette stood stark against the gray winter sky, tall windows gleaming like watchful eyes. "We've arrived, Miss Sutton," the driver announced, his voice nearly lost in the howling wind. Margaret nodded, anxiety gripping her chest. She had accepted the position as governess to the Miller children just 2 weeks prior, and this would be her first time meeting the family. The position paid handsomely, suspiciously so, but after her father's passing left her with mounting debts, she couldn't afford to be selective. As she stepped from the carriage, her boots crunching in the fresh snow, Margaret noticed a figure watching from a third-floor window. The attic, she presumed. When she looked again, the figure was gone. The massive oak door swung open before she could knock. A stern-faced woman in her 50s greeted her with cold eyes. "Miss Sutton, I presume?" "I am Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper." Her voice was as frigid as the air. "You're expected. The family has gathered for their annual winter reunion." Margaret followed Mrs. Winters through the grand foyer, where ornate woodwork and expensive furnishings spoke of old money and privilege. Family portraits lined the walls, generations of Millers, their expressions uniformly severe. "The Miller family has occupied this estate for 4 generations," Mrs. Winters explained as they climbed the main staircase. "Mr. Edmund Miller is the current master. His brother Jonathan and sister Eleanor have arrived with their families for the annual gathering." Margaret nodded, noting how the housekeeper's eyes darted nervously to the ceiling as a floorboard creaked overhead. "Your quarters are on the 2nd floor adjacent to the children's rooms. You will be responsible for the education and care of young William and Elizabeth." Mrs. Winters paused, lowering her voice. "There are rules in this house, Miss Sutton. The 3rd floor is strictly forbidden. Under no circumstances are you or the children to venture there." "May I ask why?" Margaret inquired. Mrs. Winters' expression darkened. "It is not your place to question the family's wishes, merely to obey them." As they reached the 2nd floor landing, a child's laughter echoed from somewhere above from the forbidden 3rd floor. Mrs. Winters froze, her face paling. "Did you hear that?" Margaret asked. "Hear what?" the housekeeper snapped. "The wind plays tricks in these old walls. Nothing more." But Margaret was certain it wasn't the wind, and when she glanced up at the narrow staircase leading to the 3rd floor, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Fresh footprints in the dust, small like a child's, leading upward. "Your room," Mrs. Winters announced, opening a door and effectively ending any further discussion. "Unpack and rest. Dinner is served at 6 sharp. The family is eager to meet you." As the housekeeper left, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She approached her window, gazing out at the now heavily falling snow that would surely make the roads impassable before morning. She was effectively trapped here until the weather cleared. And something told her that the strange prohibition against the 3rd floor was only the beginning of the secrets hidden within the walls of Miller Estate. Dinner that evening was a tense affair. The massive oak dining table, which could easily seat 20, was occupied by just 7 people, with Margaret placed at the far end, close enough to observe, yet far enough to feel excluded. Edmund Miller sat at the head, a man in his early 50s with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything with cold calculation. To his right sat his wife, Vivian, beautiful but fragile, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted her wineglass. "Miss Sutton," Edmund addressed her directly for the first time. "I trust your journey was not too arduous?" "The weather made it challenging, sir, but I managed well enough," Margaret replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Jonathan Miller, Edmund's younger brother, chuckled darkly. "You arrived just in time. No one will be leaving now until the storm passes. The Millers always gather in winter, and winter always ensures we remain gathered." There was an edge to his voice that suggested he found this tradition less than pleasant. Eleanor, the sister, shot him a warning glance before turning to Margaret with a forced smile. "We're pleased you've joined us. The children have been without proper instruction since the unfortunate departure of the previous governess." Margaret noticed how the table tensed at the mention of her predecessor. "May I ask what happened to her?" A heavy silence fell over the room. "She left quite suddenly," Edmund finally said, his tone brooking no further discussion. "A family emergency, as I recall." Vivian's fork clattered against her plate. "She heard things," she whispered, eyes unfocused. "She said she heard children crying in the attic, but that's impossible because—" "Vivian," Edmund's sharp voice cut through her rambling. "You're overwrought. Perhaps you should retire early." The young William, no more than 8 years old, looked up from his plate. "I hear them too, father. At night." The silence that followed was deafening. "Nonsense," Jonathan interrupted too quickly. "Old houses make noises. Settling beams, drafty corridors." Elizabeth, a solemn girl of 10, stared directly at Margaret. They only cry in winter, when everyone's here. They want to come down and join us. That's enough. Edmund's fist came down hard on the table, making the silverware jump. Miss Sutton, you'll find that children with active imaginations require firm guidance. I trust you'll provide it. The remainder of the meal passed in uncomfortable silence. As servants cleared the dishes, Margaret noticed Mrs. Winters exchanging a meaningful look with Edmund. Something unspoken passed between them. Later, as Margaret prepared for bed, a soft knock sounded at her door. It was Elizabeth, her small face serious in the candlelight. Miss Sutton, I came to warn you, she whispered, glancing nervously down the hall. Don't go up there, even if you hear them calling. Father says they're not real, but they are. Who's not real, Elizabeth? The girl's eyes widened. The other Millers, the ones they keep locked away. Her voice dropped even lower. Winter is when they get hungry. Before Margaret could question her further, the girl darted away down the corridor. Left alone, Margaret closed and locked her door, but sleep remained elusive. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, sealing them all within the mansion's walls. Around midnight, just as she was drifting off, Margaret bolted upright. Above her head, directly from the third floor, came the unmistakable sound of children's laughter, followed by what could only be described as something heavy being dragged across the floor. Then silence, until a single clear knock sounded on her ceiling as if something above wanted her attention. Margaret awoke the next morning to find the world outside transformed. Snow had piled against the windows, and beyond them the landscape was an endless white void. The blizzard had not abated. If anything, it seemed to have intensified overnight. At breakfast, only the children and Mrs. Winters were present. The adults often take breakfast in their rooms during these gatherings, the housekeeper explained tersely when Margaret inquired. You'll begin lessons with the children in the library after they've eaten. As they made their way to the library, Margaret noticed William whispering something to Elizabeth, who shot a fearful glance toward the staircase leading to the third floor. The library was an impressive chamber filled with leather-bound books from floor to ceiling. A large fireplace roared with fresh logs, yet the room retained a persistent chill. Now Margaret began, trying to establish normalcy. Let's assess where you are in your studies. Elizabeth remained distracted, her eyes continually drifting to the ceiling. William seemed more present, but jumped at every creak and groan of the old house. Miss Sutton, Elizabeth finally said, did you hear them last night? Margaret hesitated, unsure how to respond. I heard many things. Old houses are full of noises. That's what they always say, William muttered, but they know. Everyone knows. Knows what, William? The boy exchanged glances with his sister before speaking. About the others. The ones who come out during the gathering. Margaret set down her book. I think you should explain. Elizabeth leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. Every year when the family gathers, strange things happen. People go missing. Missing? William nodded solemnly. Like Miss Davis, the governess before you, and Cousin Abigail last year. She went to check on a noise in the attic, Elizabeth continued. Father said she returned to Boston early, but she left all her things behind. Quote, even her locket with her mother's portrait. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty room. And you believe something happened to her? In the attic? Both children nodded in unison. Father locks it every morning, William said. But by night, the door is always open again. Their lesson was interrupted by the arrival of Jonathan Miller, who appeared agitated. Miss Sutton, he said, his voice strained. My brother requests your presence in his study immediately. The children looked alarmed. Margaret squeezed their hands reassuringly before following Jonathan through the labyrinthine corridors of the mansion. Edmund's study was a dark-paneled room dominated by a massive desk. Maps of the estate and surrounding lands covered one wall. Edmund stood staring out the window, his back to the door. Miss Sutton, he acknowledged without turning. I understand the children have been filling your head with stories. Margaret stiffened. They seemed troubled by certain beliefs regarding the third floor. Edmund turned, his expression unreadable. My family has owned this land for generations, Miss Sutton. With that legacy comes ... complications, stories, superstitions. He paced slowly. The third floor was sealed decades ago due to structural concerns. Nothing more. Then why do the children believe? Because children believe what frightens them, he interrupted sharply. The Millers have always had a flair for the dramatic. These winter gatherings tend to heighten imaginations. He moved to his desk and withdrew an envelope. Your first month's wages in advance. I trust this demonstrates our satisfaction with your services thus far and ensures your discretion regarding family matters. The amount was substantial, far more than they had initially agreed upon. It felt like a bribe. Sir, a crash from somewhere above cut her off. Something heavy had fallen directly above them, in the supposedly empty attic. Edmund's face darkened. This winter storm has weakened the old timbers. I've asked Jonathan to secure the third floor more thoroughly. As Margaret left the study, she noticed a small door beneath the main staircase that she hadn't seen before. It stood slightly ajar, revealing a narrow servant's staircase. On impulse, she slipped inside, climbing the hidden steps that wound upward. If they reached the third floor, perhaps she could glimpse what was so forbidden. The stairs ended at a small landing with a door. Gathering her courage, Margaret pressed her ear against it and heard what sounded like shuffling footsteps and the distinct murmur of voices. Children's voices. Just as she reached for the handle, a hand clamped firmly over her mouth from behind. "Not wise, Miss Sutton," Mrs. Winters whispered harshly in her ear. "Not wise at all." The Millers would not look kindly on such curiosity, Mrs. Winters warned as she released her grip on Margaret, who stepped back, heart pounding. "There are people up there," Margaret insisted. "I heard children." Mrs. Winters' face remained impassive, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of was it fear? "This house plays tricks on newcomers. What you heard was the wind, nothing more. Then you won't mind if I look for myself." The housekeeper moved to block the door. Mr. Miller's instructions were explicit. No one enters the third floor. Why? What are they hiding? Mrs. Winters' expression softened unexpectedly. "Miss Sutton, I've served this family for 30 years. Believe me when I say some questions are better left unasked." She hesitated before adding, especially during the winter gathering. Margaret was about to press further when a bell rang somewhere below, signaling the midday meal. "The family is waiting," Mrs. Winters said with finality. Reluctantly, Margaret followed her back down the narrow stairs. Lunch was a subdued affair. Eleanor's husband, Charles, who had been absent at dinner the previous night, joined them, a bespectacled man with a nervous disposition, who kept glancing at Edmund as if seeking approval. "The storm shows no sign of abating," Charles announced after a prolonged silence. "We may be here longer than anticipated." "Wonderful," Jonathan muttered sarcastically. "Another extended Miller family reunion." "Mind your tone, brother," Edmund warned. "We honor the traditions as always." "Honor?" Jonathan laughed bitterly. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Eleanor placed a restraining hand on Jonathan's arm. "Please, not in front of the children." Margaret noticed that Vivian was absent. When she inquired politely, Edmund merely stated his wife was indisposed and changed the subject. After the meal, Margaret found herself alone with Jonathan in the corridor. His usual sardonic demeanor had fallen away, replaced by something akin to desperation. "You seem like a sensible woman, Miss Sutton," he said in a low voice. "Take my advice. Find any excuse to leave this house before nightfall." "The roads are impassable," Margaret replied. "And I've signed a contract." Jonathan's laugh was hollow. "Contracts. Yes, the Millers are fond of those. Binding agreements." He glanced nervously up at the ceiling. "Just keep the children close after dark. And whatever you hear, whatever you think you ceased, stay in your room with the door locked." Before she could question him further, he hurried away, leaving Margaret more disturbed than ever. That afternoon, during the children's rest period, Margaret decided to explore the mansion's first floor, hoping to learn more about the family whose secrets seemed to hang in the air like the persistent chill. In a forgotten corner of the house, she discovered a small parlor that appeared unused for years. Dust covers draped the furniture, but one wall remained exposed, covered entirely with framed photographs of Miller family members through the decades. Margaret examined them carefully, noting the solemn expressions typical of early photography. But one image made her pause. It showed the family gathered on the mansion's front steps, dated 1852. Edmund was there, much younger, alongside Jonathan and Eleanor as children. Behind them stood at least a dozen more children of varying ages, all with the distinctive Miller features, the same high foreheads and penetrating eyes that William and Elizabeth possessed. Yet in her time at the estate, Margaret had seen no cousins, no extended family beyond the core members. Where were all these children? As she leaned closer to examine the photograph, Margaret noticed something odd. In the window of the attic floor, barely visible but unmistakable, was the blurred image of a face watching the family gathering below, a child's face. The sound of footsteps made her turn. Vivian Miller stood in the doorway, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "You shouldn't be in here," she said, her voice barely audible. "Edmund doesn't like anyone disturbing the old photographs." Margaret gestured to the image. "There are so many children in this picture." "Where are they all now?" Vivian approached slowly, her gaze fixed on the photograph. "The Miller line was once vast and prosperous," she whispered. "But prosperity demands sacrifice. I don't understand." Vivian's eyes darted nervously to the doorway before she continued. The winter gathering isn't a reunion, Miss Sutton, it's a ritual. It's always been a ritual. She clutched Margaret's hand with surprising strength. They'll need a new offering soon. The hunger grows each year. Whose hunger? Margaret asked, though a terrible suspicion was forming in her mind. Vivian's reply was cut short by Edmund's voice booming from the hallway. Vivian, where have you gone off to? The woman's face transformed instantly into a mask of calm subservience. As Edmund appeared in the doorway, she smiled placidly. Just showing Miss Sutton some family history, my dear. Edmund's gaze hardened as it fell on the wall of photographs. Vivian, you know this room is closed for a reason. He turned to Margaret, his tone frigid. The children will be waking from their rest. Attend to your duties, Miss Sutton. As Margaret hurried from the room, she heard Edmund speaking in harsh whispers to his wife. Looking back, she saw Vivian nodding meekly, tears streaming down her face. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of mounting dread. Margaret went through the motions of lessons with the children, but her mind kept returning to the photograph, to Vivian's cryptic words, to the voices she'd heard in the attic. As dusk approached, the storm intensified. Wind howled around the mansion's eaves, and snow continued to pile against the windows, entombing them all within the Miller estate. And from above, barely audible beneath the storm's fury, came the soft, insistent sound of children's footsteps moving back and forth across the sealed third floor. Dinner that evening was delayed. Margaret sat with William and Elizabeth in the library, the children unusually quiet as they worked on their arithmetic. Occasionally, Elizabeth would glance up at the ceiling, then return to her work with renewed concentration, as if forcing herself to ignore whatever she thought she heard. Where is everyone? Margaret finally asked when the dinner bell remained silent well past the usual hour. William shrugged without looking up. They're preparing. It's the third night. Preparing for what? The offering, Elizabeth whispered, earning a sharp look from her brother. Before Margaret could question them further, Mrs. Winters appeared at the door, her usual composure noticeably strained. There's been a change of plans, the housekeeper announced. The family will dine privately tonight. I've had trays prepared for you and the children to eat here. Margaret stood, concern mounting. Something wrong? Mrs. Winters avoided her gaze. Family business. Nothing that need concern you. As the housekeeper turned to leave, Margaret noticed dark stains on the cuff of her sleeve, stains that looked disturbingly like blood. Mrs. Winters, you're hurt, she said, reaching for the woman's arm. The housekeeper recoiled. It's nothing. A small accident in the kitchen. She hurried away, leaving Margaret increasingly uneasy. After they had eaten, Margaret decided to put the children to bed early. As she tucked Elizabeth in, the girl grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. Don't sleep tonight, Miss Sutton, she pleaded. They'll come down after midnight. They always do on the third night. Who comes down, Elizabeth? The girl's eyes welled with tears. The hungry ones. The ones father keeps locked away. William, watching from his adjacent bed, added solemnly, they took Cousin Abigail last year, and Miss Davis before you. They need to feed. Margaret sat on the edge of Elizabeth's bed, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. Listen to me, both of you. I want you to lock your door tonight and not open it for anyone but me. Understand? The children nodded, their faces grave. Now tell me everything you know about what happens during these winter gatherings. William and Elizabeth exchanged glances before the boy spoke. Every winter, the family comes together. Father says it's tradition, but it's really because of the pact. What pact? Great-grandfather Miller made a deal, Elizabeth continued, for wealth and prosperity. But it came with a price. What kind of price? Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. Blood, William whispered. Miller blood. That's why the family is so small now. Each winter they need to feed. A cold realization washed over Margaret. And if there's no Miller blood available, then they take whoever's here, Elizabeth said simply. Like Miss Davis. Like the stable boy 2 winters ago. The implications were horrifying. Margaret tried to tell herself these were just children's imaginings, ghost stories spun out of control. But the genuine terror in their eyes, the strange behavior of the family, the forbidden third floor, all suggested something far more sinister. Stay in your room tonight, she instructed firmly. Barricade the door if you must. I'm going to find out what's really happening in this house. After leaving the children, Margaret returned to her own room, mind racing. If even half of what the children believed was true, everyone in the house was in danger. She needed evidence, something concrete she could use to confront Edmund, or, if necessary, to justify fleeing into the blizzard. As she paced her room debating her next move, a soft knock sounded at her door. Heart pounding, she approached cautiously. Who is it? She called. Jonathan Miller, came the reply. Please, I haven't much time. Margaret opened the door to find Edmund's brother, his face ashen, clutching a leather-bound book. May I come in? He asked, glancing nervously down the corridor. Once inside, Jonathan locked the door behind him. "I've tried for years to end this," he said without preamble. But Edmund controls everything, the estate, the fortune, the family legacy. What exactly is happening here, Mr. Miller?" Jonathan handed her the book, "My grandfather's journal. Read it if you want proof of what I'm telling you." His hands trembled. The Miller fortune wasn't built on coal mining as the official story goes. It was built on blood magic, a bargain made in 1799 with something that should not exist in a rational world. Margaret opened the journal, finding pages filled with meticulous handwriting, diagrams, and what appeared to be ritual instructions, pages of names, all Millers with dates beside them, dates that corresponded with winter gatherings. "My grandfather found a way to seal them in the attic," Jonathan continued. "But they require feeding Miller blood preferably. But they'll take what they can get." "And tonight?" Margaret asked, dreading the answer. Jonathan's face crumpled. "Eleanor has agreed to sacrifice her son. Thomas is only 12, but the family voted." Edmund was persuasive, as always. Horror washed over Margaret. "We have to stop this. We have to get help." "There is no help," Jonathan replied bitterly. "The nearest town is 20 miles away, impassable in this storm. And who would believe such a tale?" He moved toward the door. "I came to warn you to keep to your room tonight. Lock your door. At dawn, I'll help you and the children escape." "And Thomas?" Jonathan's expression hardened. "I've tried to save others before. It never ends well." After he left, Margaret sat trembling on the edge of her bed, the journal open before her. The entries detailed generations of Millers sacrificed to whatever lurked in the Attica covenant of prosperity that demanded blood payment each winter. The most recent entries were in Edmund's handwriting. Clinical descriptions of offerings and yields, increases in the family fortune corresponding to each sacrifice. As the grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight, Margaret made her decision. Journal in hand, she slipped into the corridor, determined to gather evidence of the family's crimes and somehow save young Thomas from his fate. The house was silent as she crept toward the main staircase. But as she passed the library, she heard voices inside Edmund and Eleanor engaged in heated conversation. "The boy is your son," Edmund was saying. "The sacrifice means more when it costs us deeply." "He's only a child," Eleanor sobbed. "There must be another way." "The covenant is clear," Edmund replied coldly. "Miller blood freely given. Would you rather I choose William or Elizabeth, or break the covenant and doom us all?" Margaret backed away from the door, sickened. This was no superstition or family metaphor. They were actually planning to murder a child as part of some twisted ritual. As she turned to flee, she collided with Charles, Eleanor's husband, who grabbed her arms. "Eavesdropping, Miss Sutton?" he hissed. "Edmund warned us you were too curious." Margaret struggled, but Charles's grip was iron. "Release me at once. I'll report what's happening here to the authorities." Charles laughed mirthlessly. "By the time the road's clear, there will be nothing to report. No evidence, no missing child. The Millers have maintained their secret for generations." He began dragging her toward the library door. Inside, Edmund and Eleanor fell silent as Charles pushed Margaret into the room. "She knows," Charles announced. "I caught her listening." Edmund studied Margaret with cold calculation. "How unfortunate, Miss Sutton. We had such hopes for you as governess." Eleanor wiped her tears, composure returning as she regarded Margaret. "Perhaps, ... perhaps this is a sign. Thomas's family, but Miss Sutton ... double quotes. Understanding dawned in Edmund's eyes. "A substitution?" "Yes. The covenant allows for it under certain circumstances." He approached Margaret slowly. "It seems, Miss Sutton, that you may serve the Miller family in ways you never anticipated." "I will do no such thing," Margaret declared, backing away until she hit the bookcase behind her. "You're all mad if you believe in these superstitions." Edmund's smile was chilling. "Not superstition, Miss Sutton. Family history. Family prosperity." He gestured around the opulent library. "How do you imagine a single family maintains such wealth through generations? Through market crashes and economic collapses? Through murder," apparently, Margaret spat, trying to mask her terror with defiance. Eleanor looked at the floor, shame evident in her posture. Charles kept a firm grip on Margaret's arm, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. "Secure her in the cellar for now," Edmund instructed Charles. "We'll make the final preparations and proceed at 3 o'clock. The hunger above grows impatient." As Charles began dragging her from the room, Margaret caught sight of Jonathan watching from the shadows of the corridor, his expression torn between fear and resolve. The cellar was cold and damp, lit only by a single oil lamp Charles left hanging on a hook. The space was surprisingly clean, almost clinical, with stone floors that sloped to central drains. Along one wall stood what appeared to be an altar of sorts, ancient and worn with dark stains that centuries of scrubbing had failed to remove. Margaret pounded on the heavy wooden door until her hands were raw, but no one came. In desperation, she searched the cellar for anything that might serve as a weapon or tool for escape, but found nothing. Hours seemed to pass, though without a clock she couldn't be certain. The silence was broken only by the occasional creak of floorboards from above, and once, distantly, what sounded like a child's wail, quickly silenced. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm her, the door creaked open. Margaret braced herself to fight, but it was William who slipped inside, clutching a ring of keys. "Miss Sutton," he whispered urgently, "we don't have much time. Uncle Jonathan sent me to free you, William." "How did you?" "The servants' passages," he explained, already moving to unlock the chains Edmund had used to secure the cellar door. "Elizabeth is creating a distraction. Uncle Jonathan is trying to get Thomas away." The boy's composure was remarkable, considering the circumstances. "We've prepared a way out through the greenhouse. Uncle Jonathan has a sleigh waiting on the east side of the property where the snow isn't as deep." As they slipped from the cellar, Margaret noticed the house had fallen eerily silent. Even the storm seemed to have abated, the wind no longer howling around the eaves. "Where is everyone?" she whispered as they crept through the kitchen. "Father and the others are in the ritual room," William replied, his voice emotionless, "preparing the offering space." The casual way he referred to such horrors sent chills through Margaret. "William, how long have you known about ... what happens here?" The boy's eyes met hers, ancient in his young face. "I've always known, we all have. It's the Miller legacy." They had reached a narrow door that led to the attached greenhouse, its glass panes frosted with ice. William pushed it open, revealing a space filled with exotic plants and herbs, many of which Margaret recognized from the journal's ritual pages. Jonathan was there, along with Elizabeth, and a terrified-looking boy Margaret assumed was Thomas. "You made it," Jonathan said, relief evident in his voice. "We need to hurry. They'll discover Thomas is missing any moment." "What about Mrs. Winters?" Margaret asked. "And Vivian?" "Vivian helped us," Elizabeth explained. "She's distracting Father. Mrs. Winters ... double quotes," the girl trailed off, looking to Jonathan. "Mrs. Winters serves the Covenant," Jonathan said grimly. "She would not help us." He led them to a small door at the far end of the greenhouse that opened onto a snow-covered path. Beyond, barely visible through the gently falling snow, stood a sleigh with 2 horses pawing nervously at the ground. "The main roads are blocked," Jonathan explained as they hurried toward it. "But there's an old logging trail that connects to the southern road. If we reach it before they realize we're gone." A gunshot cracked through the night air, and Jonathan stumbled, clutching his side. "Going somewhere, brother?" Edmund's voice called from behind them. Margaret turned to see Edmund standing in the greenhouse doorway, a smoking pistol in his hand. Behind him stood Charles, Mrs. Winters, and several servants Margaret hadn't seen before, all carrying lanterns that cast long shadows across the snow. "Children, come here at once," Edmund commanded. William and Elizabeth hesitated, torn between obedience and fear. "Run!" Jonathan gasped, pushing Thomas toward the sleigh. "Margaret, get them away!" Edmund fired again, the bullet splintering the wooden frame of the sleigh. "The Covenant will not be denied," he called, advancing steadily through the snow. "You know what happens if we fail to provide the offering, Jonathan. You've seen the consequences." Margaret helped the wounded Jonathan toward the sleigh while trying to shepherd the children ahead of her. Thomas had already climbed aboard, his face pale with terror. "What consequences?" Margaret demanded, stalling for time as Elizabeth and William finally broke from their indecision and dashed for the sleigh. Edmund gestured toward the house, where Margaret was horrified to see movement behind every window of the 3rd floor. Dozens of small, pale faces pressed against the glass, watching hungrily. "If not fed," Edmund explained with terrible calm, "they will feed themselves. The barriers weaken. They would descend upon us all, upon the town beyond, upon the countryside. The Covenant contains them as much as it sustains us." "You're insane," Margaret said, though the sight of those faces in the windows sent primal fear coursing through her. Edmund raised his pistol again. "One life for many, Miss Sutton." A calculation any rational person would make. Before he could fire, a figure burst from the greenhouse, Vivian, her hair wild, clutching something in her hands. "Enough, Edmund," she cried. "No more children, no more blood." In her hands, Margaret realized with shock, was a kerosene lampstand in one fluid motion. Vivian hurled it through the greenhouse glass toward the house. The lamp shattered against the mansion's wooden siding, flames immediately licking upward in the dry winter air. Chaos erupted. Edmund ran toward his wife, Charles and the servants rushing to extinguish the rapidly spreading fire. In the confusion, Margaret managed to get Jonathan and the children into the sleigh. "Go!" Jonathan gasped, blood seeping through his fingers where he pressed them to his wound. "Due south, follow the stars." "There's a town. You're coming with us," Margaret insisted, helping him into the sleigh beside the children. As she grabbed the reins, a scream pierced the night, not from the ground but from above. Margaret looked up to see the third-floor windows of the mansion now shattered, the fire racing up the side of the house toward the attic. And through the broken windows, pale, emaciated figures were emerging, climbing down the sides of the house with inhuman agility, their movements spider-like and wrong. "Dear God," Jonathan whispered, "the fire has broken the seals. They're free." The sight galvanized Margaret. She snapped the reins hard and the horses lurched forward, pulling the sleigh into the night as the screams behind them. Multiplied screams of the hunting and the hunted becoming indistinguishable in the winter darkness. The sleigh cut through the freshly fallen snow, moonlight providing just enough illumination to follow the narrow path through the dense forest surrounding the Miller estate. Margaret's hands ached from gripping the reins so tightly, but fear drove her forward, away from the horror they had narrowly escaped. Beside her, Jonathan fought to remain conscious, his breathing shallow as blood continued to seep through his makeshift bandage. In the back of the sleigh, the three children huddled together, Thomas sobbing quietly, while William and Elizabeth maintained an eerie calm that seemed at odds with their young ages. "How far to the town?" Margaret called over her shoulder. 10 miles, perhaps," Jonathan replied weakly. "Follow this path until it joins the main road." The howling of the wind almost masked the sounds behind them, almost but not quite. Even over the runners cutting through snow and the labored breathing of the horses, Margaret could hear distant screams and what sounded horribly like pursuit. "They're following us," Elizabeth stated matter-of-factly, staring back toward the faint orange glow that marked the burning mansion. "They can't leave the property," William objected, though his voice lacked conviction. "The covenant binds them to Millerland." Jonathan coughed, flecks of blood staining his lips. "The fire, it's destroyed the bindings. The old symbols carved into the foundation stones, He struggled to sit up. "For generations we've maintained those wards. Now they're free." Margaret urged the horses faster, though the poor beasts were already struggling through the deep snow. The path narrowed as they plunged deeper into the forest, branches scraping against the sides of the sleigh. "What exactly are they?" Margaret dared to ask, keeping her voice low so as not to further frighten Thomas, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep against Elizabeth's shoulder. Jonathan's laugh turned into another coughing fit. "The first Millers. The ones who made the covenant." His eyes reflected the moonlight, fever-bright. "My great-grandfather Ezekiel Miller discovered something in these woods in 1799, something ancient that promised prosperity in exchange for blood. The bargain was sealed, but Ezekiel was cleverer than most. He found a way to bind the entities to the attic to feed them only at appointed times." "His own family?" Margaret asked, horrified. "The covenant demanded Miller blood," Jonathan confirmed. "Each winter gathering one was chosen. Over generations the hunger grew. One sacrifice became 2, then more. A howl echoed through the trees, not a wolf, but something that approximated a human voice twisted into an animal's cry. "They're getting closer," Elizabeth whispered. Margaret snapped the reins again, heart pounding. "We need to go faster. The horses can't maintain this pace in the deep snow," Jonathan warned. "We need another solution." His face, ghostly pale in the moonlight, hardened with resolve. "You need to leave me behind." "Absolutely not," Margaret objected. "I'm dying anyway," he insisted. Edmund's bullet found its mark. "I won't last until morning." He gripped her arm with surprising strength. "Miller blood, freely given, will satisfy them, at least temporarily. It might buy you enough time to reach town." "Uncle? No," William cried, lunging forward from the back of the sleigh. Jonathan embraced his nephew. "Listen to me, William. The covenant must end. You and Elizabeth must never return to that place, never continue the family traditions. Promise me." The boy nodded solemnly. "I promise." Another howl, closer now, was joined by several Mara chorus of inhuman voices converging on their position. "There's a clearing ahead," Jonathan instructed, his voice growing weaker. "Stop there." Margaret wanted to refuse, to push on, but the rational part of her mind knew Jonathan was right. The horses were flagging, and whatever pursued them was gaining ground rapidly. The clearing appeared suddenly, perfect circle of untouched snow gleaming in the moonlight. Margaret pulled the horses to a stop at its edge, something primal warning her against entering that too perfect space. "This is Millerland," Jonathan explained, struggling to sit up. "The original boundaries. Help me down." "There must be another way," Margaret pleaded. Jonathan shook his head. "Get the children to safety. Tell what happened here, all of it. Make sure this ends with my generation." His eyes bore into hers. "Promise me." With a heavy heart, Margaret helped Jonathan down from the sleigh. He could barely stand, leaning heavily against her as she guided him to the center of the clearing. "Go," he urged. "Don't look back." William and Elizabeth called tearful goodbyes to their uncle as Margaret returned to the sleigh and took up the reins once more. "Close your eyes, children," she instructed as she urged the horses forward, skirting the edge of the clearing toward the continuation of the path on the far side. They were halfway around when the first of the pursuers burst from the tree line behind them, pale, emaciated figures that moved with unnatural speed across the snow, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and wrong. They wore the tattered remains of fine clothing from different eras, generations of millers, Margaret realized with horror. Jonathan stood tall despite his wound, facing the approaching entities. "I, Jonathan Miller, offer myself freely according to the covenant of 1799, he called out, his voice surprisingly strong. "Miller blood for Miller blood." The creatures hesitated at the edge of the clearing, their gaunt faces turning toward Jonathan with hungry interest. Margaret didn't wait to see more. She snapped the reins hard, and the horses plunged back into the forest on the far side of the clearing. Behind them came sounds no human should ever have to hear. Jonathan's final scream cut mercifully short, followed by wet, tearing noises that made Margaret's stomach clench. They rode in grim silence for what seemed like hours, the path eventually widening as it joined a proper road. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when they spotted the first buildings of a small town ahead. "We made it," Margaret whispered, hardly daring to believe they had escaped. As they approached the town's single church, its steeple silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky, Elizabeth suddenly grabbed Margaret's arm. "They're still coming," she said, her young face grave. "Uncle Jonathan bought us time, but they won't stop. They've tasted freedom now." Margaret turned to look behind them and saw with dawning horror distant figures moving along the road they had just traveled, too far to make out clearly, but moving with that same wrong gait she had glimpsed in the clearing. "How do we stop them?" she asked, not expecting an answer from a child. It was William who responded, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "Fire purifies. Great-grandfather's journal said fire was their weakness." "Then we burn them," Margaret decided, steering the exhausted horses toward the church where lights were already visible inside. "We warn the town, and we finish what your uncle started." The Reverend Thomas Blackwood was preparing for morning service when the sleigh pulled up outside his church. The sight that greeted him, a disheveled young woman and 3 children, all bearing signs of trauma and exposure, sent him rushing to their aid. "My God, what's happened to you?" he exclaimed, helping Margaret down from the driver's seat. "Reverend, there's no time to explain fully," Margaret said urgently. "The town is in danger. We need to organize the men, gather weapons and torches." The clergyman's eyebrows rose in alarm. "Danger? From what?" Before Margaret could formulate a response that wouldn't sound like madness, William stepped forward. "The Miller family, sir. You know of them?" Recognition dawned on the Reverend's face. "The estate to the north?" "Of course, one of the oldest families in Pennsylvania. And one of its darkest secrets," Margaret added. "Please, is there somewhere the children can rest while I explain?" Within minutes they were settled in the church's small study, the children given blankets and hot tea while Margaret recounted their ordeal to Reverend Blackwood. She expected disbelief, perhaps even accusations of hysteria, but the Reverend's expression grew increasingly grave as she spoke. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment before responding. "There have always been rumors about the Millers," he finally said. "Whispers of strange practices, of people who visited the estate and were never seen again." He steepled his fingers. "My predecessor kept records accounts of unusual events dating back nearly 80 years. Disappearances that coincided with the winter months. Strange lights seen in the forest near Millerland." "Then you believe me?" Margaret asked, relief washing over her. "I believe something unnatural has occurred," the Reverend replied cautiously. "And I believe those children have witnessed horrors no child should ever see." He rose decisively. "I'll summon the town council immediately." Within the hour, the church was filled with the town's leading citizens, the mayor, the sheriff, the doctor, and several prominent businessmen. Margaret repeated her account, this time with William and Elizabeth adding details about the family history and the creatures that had pursued them. The reactions were mixed, some openly skeptical, others clearly frightened. "Even if we accept this fantastic story," the mayor said, "what would you have us do? Send men into a blizzard to hunt monsters?" "The snow has stopped," the sheriff pointed out. "And if there's even a chance, this threat is real." "It's real," William insisted, his young voice carrying surprising authority, "and they're coming. They'll reach town by nightfall." The debate continued until Elizabeth, who had been silent for some time, suddenly stood. "They're afraid of fire," she announced. "And they can't cross running water unless invited. The journal said so." All eyes turned to the child. "The Miller River separates this town from the northern forest," she continued. "They'll need to use the bridge. If we destroy it and set watch with fire along the riverbank, we can hold them back. The simple logic of her plan silenced the room. Out of the mouths of babes, Reverend Blackwood murmured, "Sheriff, can we organize men to secure the bridge and riverbank?" The sheriff nodded grimly. "I can have 20 men armed and ready within the hour." "See to it," the mayor ordered, his skepticism giving way to pragmatism, "and send runners to the neighboring farms. Everyone within 5 miles should take shelter in town tonight." As the men dispersed to their tasks, the doctor approached Margaret and the children. "You should rest," he advised, noting their exhaustion. "The parsonage has spare rooms. I'll tend to any wounds there." Margaret nodded gratefully, the events of the past 24 hours finally catching up with her. But as she rose to follow the doctor, William tugged at her sleeve. "It won't be enough," he whispered, his eyes wise beyond their years. "Fire and water will slow them, but the Covenant is older than these things. They'll find a way through." Margaret knelt to meet his gaze. "What else can we do?" The boy glanced at his sister, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "There's a ritual in great-grandfather's journal," William said, "a way to unmake the Covenant. But it requires Miller blood freely given at the place where the Covenant began." "Your uncle already sacrificed himself," Margaret reminded him gently. "It wasn't at the original site," Elizabeth interjected. "The ritual must be performed at the Standing Stones in the North Woods. That's where great-grandfather Ezekiel made the first bargain." Margaret felt a chill run through her. "You're not suggesting ... double quotes we have to go back," William said simply. "Elizabeth and we're the last of the Miller line now. It has to be us." "Absolutely not," Margaret declared. "I won't let you sacrifice yourselves." Elizabeth took Margaret's hand. "Not sacrifice. The journal said the Covenant could be unmade by the same blood that made it, freely offering renunciation under the winter moon. We don't have to die, we just have to be there at the stones. With the right words." The conviction in the children's faces gave Margaret pause. Everything she knew is irrational. Educated woman told her this was madness, yet everything she had witnessed at the Miller estate defied rational explanation. "How would we even find these stones?" she asked, not quite believing she was considering the idea. "We know where they are," William assured her. "All Miller children are shown the sacred places." Margaret looked between the siblings, these children who seemed to carry the weight of generations on their small shoulders. "Let me speak with the sheriff first," she decided. "If the town's defenses seem insufficient, then we'll consider this plan." By mid-afternoon, the town had transformed into an armed camp. The wooden bridge across the Miller River had been partially dismantled, leaving only the central support beams intact. Men with rifles and torches patrolled the riverbank, while women and children gathered in the church and town hall. Margaret stood with the sheriff on a small rise overlooking the river, watching the forest on the far bank for any sign of movement. "Still nothing," the sheriff reported, lowering his spyglass. "Maybe they aren't coming after all." Margaret wasn't reassured. The knot of dread in her stomach had only grown tighter as the day progressed. "They'll come at nightfall," she said with certainty. "They've always preferred the dark." As if to punctuate her words, the sun began to sink behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. "Sheriff," she said finally, "I need to borrow a horse." The man turned to her in surprise. "You're not thinking of going back out there?" "Not alone," she replied. "William and Elizabeth believe they know a way to end this permanently. It may be our only chance." The sheriff studied her face for a long moment before responding. "Those children have been through hell. You want to drag them back toward the danger?" "They're already in danger," Margaret countered. "We all are. And they understand these things better than anyone." After further debate, the sheriff reluctantly agreed, providing Margaret with a sturdy horse and basic supplies. As they prepared to depart from the parsonage, Reverend Blackwood pressed a small, worn Bible into William's hands. "Faith has power against darkness," the clergyman said solemnly. Remember that. The sun had fully set by the time they reached the river, a mile upstream from town where the water ran shallow enough to ford safely. The horse struggled across the icy current, carrying all three of them to the northern bank. "Which way?" Margaret asked as they emerged from the water. William pointed north-northeast into the densest part of the forest. "There, about 2 miles. We need to hurry, the moon is rising." They traveled in tense silence, Margaret constantly scanning their surroundings for any sign of the creatures. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, no owls hooting or small creatures rustling in the underbrush. "We're being watched," Elizabeth whispered, clinging to Margaret's waist. Margaret felt it too, eyes following their progress from the shadows between trees. Yet nothing moved to intercept them, almost as if they were being allowed to proceed. The standing stones appeared suddenly, 5 massive monoliths arranged in a circle around a flat central altar stone. Their surfaces covered with symbols that matched those Margaret had seen in the journal. Moonlight spilled across the site, giving the ancient carvings an eerie luminescence. "This is it," William confirmed as they dismounted. "The Covenant site." Margaret tied the horse to a nearby tree, though the animal was clearly distressed, rolling its eyes and stamping nervously. "What do we do now?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Elizabeth retrieved a small leather pouch from her coat pockets, something she must have taken from the mansion before their escape. "The ritual components," she explained, untying the pouch to reveal herbs, small bones, and a silver blade no longer than a finger. "William and I must stand on the altar stone and recite the renunciation." As the children moved toward the center of the stone circle, shadows detached themselves from the surrounding forest. The pale figures Margaret had glimpsed during their escape now emerged fully into the moonlight, emaciated. Twisted forms that had once been human, their movements jerky and wrong. They formed a ring around the standing stones, watching with hungry eyes but making no move to attack. "They're waiting," William observed calmly. "They know what we're attempting." "Will they try to stop us?" Margaret asked, positioning herself protectively near the children. "They can't enter the circle unless invited," Elizabeth explained. "That's part of the original covenant. But once we begin the ritual... ... She left the implication hanging. With methodical precision, the children arranged the ritual components on the altar stone. William opened the journal to a marked page and began reading aloud in Latin phrases that seemed to physically distort the air around them, causing Margaret's ears to ache. The watching creatures grew increasingly agitated, pacing around the perimeter of the stones. Their movements became more frenzied as Elizabeth joined her brother in the recitation, their young voices blending in perfect unison. At a certain point in the ritual, William extended his palm, and Elizabeth used the silver blade to make a small cut across it. She then did the same to her own hand. The siblings pressed their bleeding palms together, still reciting the Latin phrases. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The creatures howled in unison, a sound of such primal rage that Margaret had to cover her ears. The ground beneath them trembled, and the moonlight seemed to intensify, focusing directly on the children at the center of the stone circle. "What's happening?" Margaret cried as wind whipped suddenly around them, carrying snowflakes and dead leaves in a furious cyclone. "The covenant is breaking," William shouted over the growing cacophony. "They're being called back." The creatures were changing, their bodies elongating further, flesh seeming to melt and reform into something even less human. They clawed at the invisible barrier surrounding the stone circle, their howls transforming into words in a language Margaret didn't understand but instinctively feared. Elizabeth stumbled in the recitation, her young voice faltering. One of the creatures seized upon the weakness, lunging forward into Margaret's horror. It passed through the barrier that should have held it back. "Keep reading," Margaret urged, placing herself between the approaching horror and the children. The creature that had breached the circle bore a terrible resemblance to Edmund Miller, or what Edmund might become after decades of inhuman transformation. It fixed hungry eyes on the children, advancing with unnatural speed. Without thinking, Margaret grabbed a burning branch from the small fire they had lit for the ritual and thrust it toward the creature. It recoiled from the flames with a hiss, but didn't retreat entirely. "Finish it," Margaret demanded, continuing to wave the makeshift torch. William and Elizabeth raised their joined, bleeding hands toward the moon and spoke the final phrases of the ritual in perfect unison, their voices somehow echoing with the power of generations of Millers before them. A sound like tearing fabric filled the air, and the ground beneath the stone circle split open. Light, not the silver of moonlight, but something older, earthier, poured from the crack, engulfing the creatures surrounding them. They writhed and twisted in the light, their forms breaking apart like smoke and wind. Their screams faded to whispers, then silence as they dissolved into nothingness. The creature that had breached the circle, the thing that had once been Edmund or was connected to him somehow, fought longer than the others, clawing its way toward the children even as its body disintegrated. "The Miller line ends," William declared, his young voice carrying unnatural authority. "The covenant is broken." With those words, the remaining creature collapsed into dust, scattered by the whirling wind. The crack in the earth sealed itself, the unearthly light fading back to normal moonlight, and then silence, complete and absolute. William and Elizabeth stood together on the altar stone, their small faces solemn in the moonlight, looking older than their years. "Is it over?" Margaret asked hesitantly. William nodded. "The covenant is broken. They're gone, all of them. And the Miller curse with them," Elizabeth added, something like peace settling over her features. As they made their way back toward town, Margaret couldn't help but ask the question that had been nagging at her. "What happens to you both now with your family?" Gone? The siblings exchanged glances before William answered. We're the last Millers now. But without the covenant, without the winter gatherings, double quotes, he trailed off, seeming for the first time like the child he truly was. We can be normal. Elizabeth finished for him. We can be children again. Margaret reached down to squeeze their hands. Yes, she promised. You can be children again. I'll make sure of it. As they crested the final hill and saw the lights of the town twinkling below, the first light of dawn began to break in the east, a new day, and the promise of a future free from the shadows of the past. Spring came early that year, melting away the snow and the last visible reminders of the winter's horrors. The town had moved on, the events of that January night already fading into legend, a story to frighten children, embellished with each telling until the truth was buried beneath layers of fiction. Few remembered the exact details. A fire at the old Miller estate had claimed the lives of the family. Tragic, but these things happened in isolated manners during harsh winters. The only survivors, 2 Miller children and their governess, had been taken in by Reverend Blackwood and his wife, who had no children of their own. Margaret sat on a bench in the church garden, watching as William and Elizabeth played with the other children from town. Their laughter still surprised her sometimes. How quickly they had adapted to normal childhood after years of living under the shadow of the covenant. They're resilient, Reverend Blackwood commented, joining her on the bench. Children often are, Margaret nodded, though she knew these particular children were far from ordinary. They carried knowledge and experiences no child should bear, yet somehow they had found their way back to innocence. Have you decided? The Reverend asked after a comfortable silence. About the teaching position? The town school had offered Margaret a permanent post for the coming fall term. It would mean staying, putting down roots in this place that held such dark memories. I have, she replied. I'm accepting. The children need stability, and boppily she paused, watching as Elizabeth showed a younger girl how to make a crown from spring flowers. I need them. The Reverend smiled. You've become quite the family. Family. The word still felt strange, wonderful but fragile. Margaret had never imagined herself as a mother, yet here she was, guardian to the last of the Miller line. Later that evening, as she tucked the children into bed in the small house they now shared at the edge of town, William asked the question she'd been dreading. Do you think they could ever come back? Margaret sat on the edge of his bed, choosing her words carefully. The covenant was broken, William. You broke it. But great-grandfather's journal mentioned other entities, other bargains made throughout history. His young face was serious in the lamplight. What if someone else finds him, makes a new covenant? It was Elizabeth who answered from her bed across the room. Then someone else will break it. There are always more good people than bad ones, aren't there, Miss Sutton? Margaret smiled, smoothing the girl's hair. Yes, I believe there are. After the children had fallen asleep, Margaret sat at her small desk, opening the journal they had brought back from that night. Most of its pages were now blank. The texts and diagrams had faded away after the covenant was broken, as if they had never been written. But a few entries remained, historical accounts of the Miller family before Ezekiel's fateful bargain. Stories of ordinary people living ordinary lives. Margaret picked up her pen and began to write on the first empty page. In the spring of 1879, a new Miller family story begins. Not one of covenants and sacrifices, but of healing and hope. William and Elizabeth Miller, the last of their line, have chosen to redefine their legacy. Double quotes outside. The wind rustled through new leaves, carrying away the last whispers of winter. In the distance, the ruins of the Miller estate stood empty on the hillside, its blackened timbers gradually being reclaimed by the forest. Some said the land was cursed, that nothing would ever grow there again. But Margaret had noticed wildflowers already pushing through the ashes when they had visited to lay flowers on Jonathan's makeshift grave, life continuing, as it always did, transforming even the darkest places with the simple, persistent power of growth. The children would be all right. The Miller name would mean something different now, something chosen rather than inherited. And if shadows from the past ever threatened to return, Margaret would be ready. After all, she knew the truth now. Knew that monsters were real, but also knew they could be defeated. Not with wealth or power or ancient bargains, but with courage, sacrifice, and love. She closed the journal and extinguished her lamp, listening to the quiet breathing of the children, her children now as they slept peacefully through the night. No more winter gatherings. No more screams from sealed-off attics. Just the ordinary miracle of tomorrow waiting to unfold. 5 years later, 1884, the schoolhouse bell rang out across the town square, signaling the end of the day's lessons. Margaret gathered her teaching materials as her students hurried to collect their belongings. Eager for freedom after hours of arithmetic and literature. Remember, your essays on the Civil War are due Monday, she called over the commotion. No excuses. As the classroom emptied, William lingered behind, now 13 and growing tall. His serious nature had matured into thoughtful intelligence, making him one of Margaret's best students despite their family connection, or perhaps because of it. "Will you be late tonight?" he asked, helping her organize the scattered chalk pieces. "The town council meeting shouldn't run long," Margaret replied. At 30, she had become an unexpected voice of authority in local affairs. Elizabeth promised to start supper. William nodded, a shadow passing briefly across his features. "It's January 10th, he said quietly. The date needed no explanation. January 10th, the anniversary of their escape from Miller Estate, of Jonathan's sacrifice, of the breaking of the covenant. 5 years, Margaret acknowledged. "You've both come so far." They walked home together through the bustling town, now familiar and comfortable. Their modest house near the church had become a true home, filled with books, music, and the ordinary rhythms of family life. Elizabeth, now 15 and blossoming into a young woman with serious ambitions of medical school, was already preparing dinner when they arrived. "Mrs. Blackwood brought apple pie," she announced, "and there's a letter from Boston University regarding their women's education program." Their evening followed its comfortable routine: dinner, discussion of the day's events, reading by the fire. But as night deepened, Margaret noticed both children growing quieter, more introspective. Finally, Elizabeth spoke. "I had the dream again last night." Margaret set aside her book. The dreams came every January, memories or warnings, or perhaps simply the mind's way of processing trauma. They had learned not to dismiss them entirely. "Tell me," she encouraged gently. "I was back at the estate," Elizabeth began, "in the attic. But not as myself, as one of them, looking out the window at the family gathered below. Hungry. So hungry." She shivered despite the fire's warmth. "But this time something was different, I felt. I felt like something was stirring, awakening." William's head snapped up. "I dreamed of the stones. They were cracking like something was pushing through from underneath." Margaret felt a familiar chill. Same sensation she'd experienced 5 years ago when first approaching Miller Estate. She'd learned to trust such feelings. "It's just memories," she said, trying to convince herself as much as them. "The past can't hurt you now." But that night, after the children had gone to bed, Margaret retrieved the Miller journal from its hiding place in her desk drawer. Most pages remained blank, the covenant's records erased when the pact was broken. But as she opened it now, her breath caught. New writing had appeared on one of the formerly blank pages, spittery script that seemed to writhe on the paper, forming words in archaic English. "Covenant severed, not destroyed. Blood price unpaid accumulates. 5th winter approaches. We hunger still." Margaret closed the journal with trembling hands. 5 winters since the breaking of the covenant. 5 years of peace and healing. The next morning, she sent the children to school without her, claiming a mild headache. Instead, she saddled her horse and rode north, toward the ruins of Miller Estate. The journey was different in daylight. In spring, less foreboding, but no less purposeful. The forest had reclaimed much of the old road, nature asserting itself over human endeavor. When she crested the final hill, Margaret reined her horse to a stop, staring in disbelief at the scene below. Where the burned-out shell of Miller Mansion should have stood, construction was underway. Scaffolding surrounded partially completed walls, workmen moving busily about the site. Someone was rebuilding the estate. Margaret approached cautiously, dismounting at the edge of the clearing. A well-dressed man in his 40s noticed her and broke away from his conversation with the foreman. "Good morning, madam," he greeted her with a slight Boston accent. "Are you lost?" "Who are you?" Margaret demanded. "What are you doing here?" The man raised an eyebrow at her tone but answered smoothly. "Harrison Caldwell. I purchased this property last autumn. And you are?" "Margaret Sutton." She studied his face, finding no resemblance to the Miller she had known. "You're rebuilding the mansion? Why?" Caldwell gestured proudly toward the construction. "A hunting lodge, primarily, though my wife insists on calling it our summer home. The location is perfect, secluded, picturesque." His expression turned curious. "Did you know the previous owners?" "I understood the property had been abandoned for some years following the tragic fire." "I knew them," Margaret confirmed cautiously. "Mr. Caldwell, there are things about this land you should be aware of." He smiled indulgently. "Local superstitions? My foreman mentioned something about the place being unlucky. I don't put much stock in such tales." "Not superstitions. History." Margaret chose her words carefully. "The Miller family had unusual practices. The fire wasn't an accident." Caldwell's smile faded. "Miss Sutton, if you're trying to frighten me away from my investment, I assure you it won't work." I've committed considerable resources to this project. Before Margaret could respond, a young boy of about 10 ran up to Caldwell. Father, look what I found in the old foundation. In his outstretched palm lay a small object that made Margaret's blood freeze, a silver pendant inscribed with the same symbols she had seen in the standing stone circle. Fascinating craftsmanship, Caldwell commented, examining the piece. There's a whole chamber we discovered beneath the original foundation stones, full of unusual artifacts. You broke into a sealed chamber beneath the house? Margaret asked, horror mounting. Progress requires disruption, Miss Sutton, Caldwell replied dismissively. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a construction project to oversee. Margaret rode back to town in a daze of dread. The covenant had never been fully broken, merely suspended. And now, unwittingly, this Caldwell person had disturbed whatever tenuous barriers remained. That evening, after the children were asleep, Margaret wrote 3 letters. One to Reverend Blackwood, explaining everything and entrusting the children to his care if the worst should happen. One to a professor of folklore at Boston University she had corresponded with occasionally. And one to William and Elizabeth themselves, to be opened when they were older, detailing the full truth of their heritage and the responsibilities it might entail. In the months that followed, Margaret watched and waited. Caldwell's hunting lodge rose from the ashes of Miller Estate, grand and imposing against the forest backdrop. Invitations went out across the Northeast for a winter gathering to celebrate its completion, a house party to begin. With cruel irony, on January 10th, though she tried to discourage it, both William and Elizabeth grew increasingly fascinated with the rebuilding. The past called to them in ways Margaret couldn't fully prevent. We should be there, William insisted during a heated discussion in late December. If something awakens, we're the only ones who know how to fight it. Your children, Margaret countered. Though at 13 and 15 they were hardly the traumatized youngsters she had rescued 5 years earlier. We're Millers, Elizabeth corrected softly. The last ones. That means something whether we want it to or not. In the end, they compromised. Margaret accepted Caldwell's invitation to tour the completed lodge. He had been persistent in inviting local dignitaries, wanting to establish himself in community society. The children would remain safely in town with the Blackwoods. The evening of January 9th found Margaret approaching the reborn mansion with trepidation. Snow had been falling steadily all day, the weather an echo of that night 5 years past. Caldwell greeted her effusively, proud to show off his creation to the local schoolteacher whose opposition had become something of a joke among his workers. You'll see there's nothing to fear, he insisted, leading her through grand hallways that followed the original floor plan with eerie precision, though we did preserve some of the more unusual architectural elements for character, including that mysterious 3rd floor you were so concerned about. The tour concluded in the Great Hall, where preparations for the next evening's gathering were underway. Servants arranged evergreen boughs and candles on long tables set for at least 30 guests. My associates from Boston arrive on tomorrow's train, Caldwell explained. The first of many winter gatherings at Caldwell Lodge, I hope. As they spoke, Margaret noticed Caldwell's young son watching them from the staircase, something furtive in his expression. When Caldwell stepped away briefly to consult with his housekeeper, Margaret approached the boy. Hello, she offered gently. We met briefly last spring. I'm Miss Sutton, the boy nodded solemnly, I remember. You were angry about father rebuilding. Not angry, concerned. She studied his face, noting his pallor. Are you well? You look tired. I hear them at night, he confided suddenly. In the walls, under the floors. Father says it's just the house settling, but... He glanced nervously toward the staircase leading to the 3rd floor. They're hungry. They keep saying they're so hungry. Ice formed in Margaret's veins. James, Caldwell's sharp voice interrupted them. It's past your bedtime. Say good night to Miss Sutton. The boy scurried away, casting one last frightened glance over his shoulder. Children and their imaginations, Caldwell chuckled, though something in his eyes had hardened. Now then, Miss Sutton, I believe our tour is concluded. As Margaret rode home through the deepening snow, certainty settled over her. History was repeating itself. Whatever force had driven the Millers' covenant had found new vessels, new blood to feed its hunger. She wasn't entirely surprised to find William and Elizabeth waiting up for her, their faces grave in the firelight. You felt it too, William said without preamble. Margaret nodded, setting aside her snow-covered cloak. It's awakening. The boy hears them in the walls. Tomorrow night Caldwell hosts a gathering of 30 guests, a sacrifice, Elizabeth whispered. It's seeking a new covenant. We have to stop it, William said firmly. Tonight, before the guests arrive. Margaret studied their determined faces, no longer children but not quite adults, shaped by knowledge most people would never comprehend. The 3 of us against an ancient evil, she said with a grim smile. Poor odds. Better than none, Elizabeth replied. We know what we're facing. Caldwell doesn't. They prepared methodically, gathering kerosene, salt, silver items, and the ritual components Elizabeth had preserved. The Miller Journal provided fragmented guidance, its pages alternating between blank voids and newly appeared text that seemed to taunt them with half-revealed secrets. Midnight found them approaching Caldwell Lodge from the forest side, away from the caretaker's cottage. Snow fell in thick, silent curtains, muffling their footsteps and obscuring them from view. The mansion stood dark except for a single light burning in an upper window. The third floor, Margaret noted with a chill. How do we get in? William whispered as they crouched at the forest's edge. It's the old servants' entrance, Margaret replied. If Caldwell followed the original plans exactly, the door was where she remembered, half hidden behind kitchen gardens now dormant under winter snow. To Margaret's surprise, it opened with a gentle push, unlocked and waiting. The interior was eerily silent, the grand renovations creating perfect acoustics for the absence of sound. They moved cautiously through the kitchen and service areas toward the main hall. We need to find the entrance to the chamber beneath the foundation, Margaret whispered. Caldwell mentioned finding it during construction. William pointed to a narrow door beneath the main staircase, the same location as in the original mansion, the servants' stairs. They'll lead to the cellar. The door creaked as Elizabeth eased it open, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. Margaret lit the small lantern they'd brought, its flame casting long shadows as they made their way down. The cellar was larger than Margaret remembered, expanded during renovation. Modern wine racks lined one wall, while storage crates and construction materials filled another section. But at the far end, something new, or rather something very old, had been uncovered. An arched stone doorway stood open, revealing a chamber beyond. Torches in ancient iron brackets burned with steady flames despite the lack of attendance. Someone's been here recently, Margaret observed. They approached the threshold cautiously. The chamber beyond was circular, its walls inscribed with familiar symbols matching those from the standing stones. In the center stood an altar stone that might have been the twin of the one in the forest circle. The surface of the altar was stained dark with what could only be blood, some of it ancient, some alarmingly fresh. Caldwell, Elizabeth whispered. He's already begun the ritual. A soft noise from behind made them turn. James Caldwell, the young boy, stood at the foot of the stairs, his face pale in the torchlight. You came to stop it, he said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. I knew someone would. Margaret approached him slowly. James, where is your father? Above, the boy replied, glancing upward. With the hungry ones. They promised him things: wealth, power, influence beyond anything he could achieve in Boston. His voice was unnaturally calm. He gave them blood. Mine. Just a little to seal the agreement. He extended his arm, showing a fresh cut across his small palm. A child's blood freely given, William muttered. The first step in establishing a new covenant. We need to get you out of here, Margaret told James, reaching for his hand. The boy shook his head. Too late. They're coming down now. They're so hungry after waiting so long. As if summoned by his words, a scratching sound began overhead, soft at first, then growing in intensity. Dust filtered down from the ceiling as something moved through the spaces between floors. The ritual, Elizabeth urged. We need to begin now before they fully manifest. William nodded, taking position at one side of the altar while Elizabeth stood at the other. They began reciting the counterspell from memory, their voices blending in the ancient Latin phrases. Margaret placed herself protectively beside James, watching as shadows gathered at the chamber's entrance, formless at first, then solidifying into the familiar emaciated figures with their wrong movements and hungry eyes. They can't cross into the chamber unless invited, James informed her calmly. Father hasn't completed the covenant yet. The entities pressed against an invisible barrier at the doorway, their forms rippling with frustration. Behind them appeared Harrison Caldwell, his expression vacant, eyes reflecting the torchlight with unnatural intensity. The children have come home, he intoned, his voice overlaid with something ancient and inhuman. Miller blood returns to fulfill the covenant. We're here to break it, William called out, never pausing in his recitation. Caldwell laughed, a sound that seemed to come from multiple throats simultaneously. The covenant cannot be broken, only transferred. Your ancestor learned this. We granted prosperity to the Millers for generations. At the cost of children's lives, Margaret countered. A fair exchange, Caldwell replied with a terrible smile. And now the Caldwells will receive our blessing. He stepped forward, placing his hand on his son's shoulder. Invite them in, James. As we discussed. The boy trembled but remained silent, pressing closer to Margaret. Caldwell's face contorted with rage. Invite them. No, James whispered. With a snarl, Caldwell seized his son's arm, dragging him toward the threshold. The blood that's sealed must also welcome, he growled. Margaret intervened, pulling James back. He's made his choice. As William and Elizabeth's chanting intensified, the air in the chamber began to shift and swirl. The symbols on the walls glowed with an eerie blue light, responding to the Miller blood present. Caldwell's expression changed from rage to fear as he realized what was happening. "Stop them," he commanded the entities crowding the doorway. But the creatures seemed confused, caught between Caldwell's incomplete covenant and the power of the Miller ritual unfolding before them. In that moment of hesitation, Margaret made her decision. Grabbing the kerosene lamp, she hurled it at the threshold where the entities gathered. Glass shattered, oil sprayed across the doorway, and flames erupted instantly. The creatures shrieked as fire engulfed them, their half-corporeal forms catching like dry tinder. Caldwell's scream joined theirs as the flames spread to his clothing, the unnatural connection between him and the entities transferring the fire's effect. "Complete the ritual," Margaret shouted to William and Elizabeth over the growing inferno. The siblings joined hands across the altar, their bleeding palms pressed together as they spoke the final words of renunciation. The stone beneath their hands cracked suddenly, a fissure opening that spread across the floor toward the burning threshold. With a sound like 1,000 voices crying out in hunger and rage, the chamber began to collapse. Ceiling stones crashed down as the foundation itself seemed to reject the unnatural forces contained within it. "Run!" Margaret grabbed James's hand, pulling him toward a narrow side passage she'd noticed earlier. William and Elizabeth broke from their position at the altar, racing to follow. The passage led upward, eventually emerging through a hidden door in the mansion's main hall. Behind them, the rumbling continued as more of the foundation collapsed. They didn't stop running until they reached the front entrance. Bursting out into the snowy night as windows shattered from the heat building within the structure. From a safe distance across the snow-covered lawn, they watched as fire spread through Caldwell Lodge with unnatural speed. Flames leaping from window to window as if guided by purposeful malevolence. "My father," James whispered, his young face illuminated by the blaze. Margaret put her arm around his shoulders. "I'm sorry." The boy nodded, a child's grief at war with the relief of escape. He changed after finding the chamber. After hearing their voices, he looked up at Margaret with ancient eyes and a young face. "Will they come back again?" It was William who answered, his voice steady despite their narrow escape. "Not if we end it permanently." Through the falling snow, they made their way to the standing stones in the forest. There, as flames consumed the mansion behind them, they completed what had been started 5 years earlier, not just a breaking of the covenant, but its complete dissolution. As dawn broke on January 10th, nothing remained of Caldwell Lodge but smoldering ruins. The authorities would later determine that faulty wiring in the newly constructed mansion had caused the tragic fire. Harrison Caldwell was counted among the dead, his body presumably consumed in the blaze. James Caldwell, sole survivor and heir, would be sent to relatives in Boston, but not before. Margaret extracted a promise that he would return the property to its natural state, never to be developed again. 1 month later, as winter began to loosen its grip on the Pennsylvania countryside, Margaret stood with William and Elizabeth at the edge of what had once been Miller Estate. Workers had cleared the last of the ruins, leaving only scorched earth that would soon be reclaimed by the forest. The standing stones had been deliberately buried, their location known only to those who had stood within their circle. "Is it truly over?" Elizabeth asked, watching as birds circled overhead, returning after a long absence. Margaret considered the question carefully before answering. "The covenant is broken. The hunger is contained. But some things never truly end, they just change form." William nodded in understanding. "Which means we remain vigilant." "We remain aware," Margaret corrected gently. "But we also live. Your Uncle Jonathan sacrificed himself so you could have normal lives, remember?" As they turned to leave, Elizabeth paused, looking back one last time. "Do you think they'll ever be at peace? The ones who were trapped for so long?" Margaret had no answer that wouldn't sound like false comfort. Some hungers, once awakened, might never truly be satisfied. Some covenants, once made, left permanent marks upon the world. But as they walked away from Miller Estate for the final time, she found herself hoping that silence would reign in that place, that the whispers from sealed attics would fade from memory, that the winter gatherings would be forgotten, and that no screams would ever again echo through those woods. Behind them, the first green shoots of spring pushed through the ashes, reclaiming what had been corrupted and making it clean again. For now, at least, that would have to be enough.